I'm Erik, this is Rachel. We're going to be talking about what it's like to do business around the world, a perspective that only a company like, or for perhaps very few companies, but among them GE, can share with us. Rachel, I think we should begin by allowing you to introduce a little bit about yourself and GE Global Growth, your organization. What is it? Where does it operate? How is it organized?
Great, thanks, Erik, and good morning, everybody. My name is Rachel Duan, and I'm the president and CEO in charge of the GE Global Growth organization. I've took on this new role in February, but I've been with GE for 22 years, and 2/3 of my working experience is actually outside the U.S., and the other third is in U.S. My responsibility is really looking at the GE markets outside the U.S. and Europe, and in charge of the overall organic and inorganic growth strategy. So we're working with all the businesses unit heads in the markets outside the US and Europe in driving growth in these global infrastructure markets.
I'm curious to know, and I think it might be instructive to people here, why GE Global Growth is organized horizontally. This was Jeff Immelt's idea back in 2011. GE previously had operated, and still does in Europe and the United States, in verticals, aviation, healthcare, for example, infrastructure. But yours is an organization that spans the globe. Why organize it that way?
Yeah, so when you really talk about the infrastructure markets, in many of the global countries, it's a horizontal play. So take example for Qatar, or take example for Brazil or China. And in every country, they need energy. They need access to affordable health care. And then because of the driving for urbanization, there's massive transportation needs. And in most of these countries, at the end of the day, we work with the customers, but a lot of these customers are state-owned. So really the ultimate customer is government. So I think GE is very well positioned. We have both the depth of our industry verticals that bring technology and service solutions. In the meantime, our ability to play horizontally across segments, interfacing with different key stakeholders in the country, start from the state heads to ministers to financing institutions, as well as to different gencos and hospitals. That actually, we view that as a strength. And that's really the birth of the Global Growth Organization.
And it works?
It works. And I think that I won't have to say, I have to say there are challenges we're going to have to continue to work through.
Such as?
So if you're really looking at I think the markets, they are very different. So I think today we're here to talk about Qatar. The markets in Qatar, Middle East, is different from China. That means macroeconomics. That also means geopolitics. On top of it, different rules and laws. So for us, it's a cookie cutter sort of approach. Doesn't really work. It may work in Qatar or in Middle East. It may not necessarily work in Brazil or China. So these are some of the challenges that we have to work through day to day. But I think the trick for GE is we really have local teams that are invested. We have almost about 2/3 of our employees outside the US and Europe, and then 95% of them are local.
Tell us about your priorities as CEO. What do you spend most of your time on? What are you most excited about? And how do you see those taking shape over the next few years?
Yeah. I mean, clearly, I think for global growth, the first foremost priority is about growth. And if you're really looking at the spaces that we are in, energy sectors, when we look in the next decades, I think we still foresee tremendous needs in the infrastructure for power. So globally, there's still about 1 billion population that does not have access to reliable power. And then 2/3 of the incremental growth is going to come outside the US and Europe. However, a lot of these infrastructure, particularly power projects today, are cross regions. So it is very complex in terms of geopolitical risks, financial risks, and operating risks. And when you're really actually executing a lot of these projects, it goes beyond one company. It requires a lot of policy coordination, capacity collaboration, as well as capital integration. And this is where I think GE, we feel that we are positioned well because we have a broad technology basket solution. In the meantime, we operate in these regions by being local. On top of it, GE Capital has the underwriting capability to really understand some of the risk on the projects. So I spend a lot of time to really try to understand how the geopolitics frameworks really impacting the growth prospects. And then when you go down to the country, you have to really understand who are the key stakeholders we're working with. And then on top of it, how do we bring, most importantly, in my view, is how do we bring the supply side of the equation, which is really resources, capital, and sometimes it's human capital to match the demand in a given country.
I want to come back to geopolitics for sure, and I also want to ask you some questions about strategy and your view of the economy. But before I get there, you mentioned, Rachel, that you've been with GE for 22 years.
Yes.
What I'd like to know, it's a different regime for GE now, right? Larry Culp is running the show. He's got a lot of wood to chop, as they say. What has changed most under Larry?
Yeah.
Relative to the CEOs whom you worked for previously?
Well, I think GE is actually 127 years old this year. So in the grand scheme of things, what we have seen the changes probably the last 18 months, if you put in 127 years, it's actually not that big of a deal. So we have been through different cycles. But forward looking, what I think what Larry bring on is two things, I think, which would be different. Number one is extremely focusing on priorities that with GE at this and the forward looking that we need to do. So first foremost is we got to fix our balance sheet. And second one is we got to go back to the operating roots. And then third foremost is that how do we bring the culture to be more candor, more transparency, and also bring the execution back to delivering the results to the shareholders.
So what have you done in GE Global Growth as a result of these priorities that he's established?
Yeah, so I think growth is the first foremost. For us is we operate in almost 180 countries outside the US and Europe. And we know for a fact in today's world, not all countries are important, but they're not equally important. So the prioritization, how do we making trade-offs? Where are we going to be investing our supply chain? Where are we going to invest in our human capital? Where are the biggest growth? That is the first foremost in terms of how do we really looking at the landscape of today's geopolitics, today's energy outlook and healthcare opportunity, and what are the countries that are most important to us. So we have done in the last couple of months really looking at the prioritization geography, which are the top countries that we need to be focusing on for the next 3 to 5 years or beyond.
So let's list some of those countries and tell us how those priorities have changed.
Yeah. So
I'm making the assumption, could be wrong,
yeah.
that some have become greater priorities and some have become lesser priorities.
Yeah. I wouldn't say the priority of the countries has changed, because I think the fact, probably the big difference, Eric, is that number one is we're not taking a cookie cutter sort of approach. Before the growth organization, we invest the same set of organizations, same set of people in, let's say, a couple dozens of countries. But really, in my view, is the approach in China versus approach in Brazil and approach in Kenya should be different, and the type of resources we're investing should be different. And therefore, I think that is the biggest change in terms of we actually really looking at 180 countries and bucketize them into different categories. There are clearly core country we need to maintain presence, but these are large. However, the infrastructure regulation are similar to what we operate like United States, for example, Australia and Japan. And when you're looking at the high growth category country like China, or Saudi or Brazil, these are also large. However, when you're looking at the regulation, the government, the macroeconomic, they're very different from what's in Australia and Japan. And then when you look at places like Myanmar or Vietnam or Colombia, these are just opening up, and you need a completely different approach. So we actually really kind of prioritize and bucketize them into different groups and really tailor our approach accordingly based on that.
David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, last week said that in recent months, the global economy has begun to decelerate at a faster rate. Is that what GE is experiencing? I
think for 2019, you clearly see the slowdown on the economy a little bit, but I think there's also pockets of bright spots. So when you really, I think Eric, if you really take a step back, right? You talk about the world economy, but you can't really talk about the geopolitics. I think the geopolitics, there's no doubt today we're living in an unprecedented time of volatility. Just read the headlines. US and China trade war this week, Brexit, Gulf tension. But behind all these geopolitical individual events, what I see in the business environment, there are some common themes that are emergent that will impact both macroeconomic and then also the environment the business is impacting. First is, and then clearly rising of protectionism. I think it's go beyond just trade tariff. I think there's a short-term, medium-term impact on investment sentiments, and potentially even medium and long-term on supply chain. Both of them will impact the global growth outlook, particularly for the emerging markets. I think second one is, in the last 10 years, we have been enjoying pretty relatively low interest rate environment, and that may come to an end, we'll see. So for the next 3 to 5 years or even beyond, probably we're going to encounter more high funding cost environment, so that may actually drive in the capital to more higher quality of projects or regions. That will also impact the business outlook. I think the third important macro trends is really the demographics changes, the rapid aging population, particularly in some of the places like Asia-Pacific region that we've seen a lot of growth in the last couple of decades. Singapore, Malaysia, Korea, they're very likely to follow the Japan demographics, and even China. So all these three mega trends is going to bring in a very different environment that the business is going to operate.
I'm curious to know, and I know you're not an economist, but what is it that GE has seen that leads you and your colleagues to believe that maybe over the next 3 to 5 years we might see a different interest rate environment? Because at the moment, the only direction anybody sees interest rates going is further down. There's talk here about potentially zero interest rates in the United States, and there are, in excess of 13, it might even be 15 or 17 trillion dollars of negative yielding interest rate product around the world.
Yeah. Well, Erik, like you said, I'm not an economist, and
but it's curious that you should say that.
Yeah, in fact, that what I said is actually might be. There's a lot of volatility, and then, frankly, for us to sit here to predict where it goes, it's probably we don't know where it's going to go. So the point is that, given all these geopolitical backdrop, I think for the next 3 to 5 years or even beyond, we will see a very different environment the business is operating in. I think
more hostile?
I wouldn't say hostile. For me, I've been 2/3 of my time working for GE is outside U.S. Europe. So I would say it's different challenges. But I'm also Chinese. Challenges in Chinese, it means also opportunities. For companies, we're going to have to adapt to these new normal. The good news, I have to say, Erik, is that the global infrastructure demand is still robust. And I think the one is because of the unmet needs we talk about, like power sector of 1 billion people doesn't have reliable power, accessible to healthcare. The other one is the climate change that really bring a energy mix sort of more toward clean, and that's where GE space is in. So we are actually optimistic in terms of the longer term sort of demand side for infrastructure needs.
I, like many other people, like that concept that Mohamed El-Erian coined of the new normal. Are the tensions that we've seen play out between the United States and China, the confrontation we might call it, part of the new normal for GE?
Well, I think we'll see. I mean, I think there's clear, so let's take GE for example. GE is an American company. Mm-hmm. We are very proud of our American roots. In the meantime, GE is also a global company. If you look at today, 60% of our revenue comes outside customers, outside the United States. So like US, China is an important market as well for GE. And we have both valued customers and employees in both the United States and in China. The issues that are raised by this administration are very important one with regard to trade. The GE long-standing, we advocate free trade and open markets. But we also advocate any issues needs to be resolved through dialogues and negotiations. We don't necessarily believe tariffs or non-tariff related barriers will solve the problem. So we encourage both governments continue the dialogue that way.
Has the standoff with China made it harder for an American company, for GE, to do business there?
I think there is direct impact on tariff. It goes without saying. It's not just for American companies. It's actually for a lot of the multinationals.
Global supply chains.
Exactly. The potential impact on global supply chains.
But in your experience specifically, what have you encountered so far?
I think that's what we have encountered, like the other multinationals. But the thing with GE is that because we are operating in 180 countries, so our global supply chain footprint allow us to mitigate those risks. Now, I think in longer term, in the longer run, U.S. and China are both one of the largest markets for GE for infrastructure, and we cannot afford not to be in both countries. I think we have to strategically think about how do we localize, where do we localize for the specific markets and for the rest of the regions.
Have you had to move supply chains to make them less China reliant than they used to be?
Well, we don't make these kind of strategic decisions just encounter one particular event. Because it's a normal, we have to live that it's going to be a while. So we actually continue to evaluate our strategic supply chain position and our existing global footprints. And the good news is we have supply chain facilities around the world. So here we're in Qatar, in Middle East, like we actually have 37 different facilities in the Middle East, and they are not serving the region, but also serving it around the world. And that kind of global supply chain footprint give us a flexibility to weather some of these geopolitical tensions.
You signed a big 787 jet engine supply deal with Qatar Airways.
Yes.
Back in July, I believe.
Yes.
What other opportunities are you pursuing in Qatar?
Well, Qatar is one of the largest country within Middle East for us. And Middle East is a very important region for GE, both strategically and also from growth perspective. So we have been in the region and Qatar incurred for more than 80 years. As we invest in a country like Qatar, we're not just looking at a commercial opportunity like the aviation deal. We are also investing in technology. So this year we're celebrating the 10th anniversary for the GE Advanced Technology and Research Center in Qatar. 10 years ago, we started in this research center for our aviation on-wing support for Qatar Airways and region. But fast forward 10 years now, we've been bringing a lot of the advanced technology and training and allowing that training center has trained almost over 3,000 plus airline employees, that including 750 employees from Qatar Airways for the advanced jet engines. In the meantime, we have oil and gas businesses have setting up advanced service shops in Qatar to serve not just Qatar, but also the region. And most recently, our healthcare technology team in Qatar Development Center has co-developed together with a global technology the latest mammography. Basically, we're driving much more patient comfort for breast cancer patients, and that is launched globally, and it's a hit. So actually, we're very encouraged of our both commercial prospects and also the innovation and the engineering investments in Qatar, and we really view that as not just serving the country per se, but also broadly integrated into the Middle East region.
How do you distinguish Qatar as a place to do business relative to the other Gulf states?
Well, I think some of the guests earlier in the panels, as watching them, they already elaborate a lot. It's a great place financially, and then the investments, it's very business friendly, and from demand side, we see a lot of opportunity. I think Qatar, and then if you put it in the overall Middle East, in GE, we are, as I mentioned earlier, Middle East in general is one of the most strategic important region for GE. Strategically and growth. We have 14,000 employees on the ground, 30 plus facilities. I think there are a lot of geopolitical instabilities in the region, which can pose, broadly speaking, the growth prospects in the region become more vulnerable. However, infrastructure needs are vast. And I also think many countries in the Middle East has put forward a new economic development plan, which is very encouraging to be prepared post-oil era, for example. And on top of it, as I'm on the ground, I'm particularly encouraged by the younger, talented workforce. I think this is actually a big plus for the Middle East. And a lot of innovation, not just in the technology area, digital, and also innovative partnership models.
Aviation is a big business for GE. How much of a headache has the 737 MAX grounding been for you?
You can read the news, you probably know as much as I do. Aviation is strong for us. It's one of the most important one, and we continue to support Boeing, our most important customer, as we work through this 737 MAX issue.
And also in the Middle East, GE was competing with Siemens for some $15 billion of power plants in Iraq. Where does that stand?
Yeah, well, we compete with the usual everywhere, not just in the Middle East. So in Iraq, actually, since 2011, we are very proud, actually, GE has been participating, bring the power generation on the ground. I think 14 gigawatts, if I remember the number correctly, since then, and that's almost 55% of the entire power generation for the country. We're very proud to be the partners of the country, that we can bring progress and solutions to that, and we'll continue to do that. GE is never afraid of competition, and we also believe that we are very well positioned to win. You know why I have confidence, Erik, is because our team is local. We have 97% of our employees on the ground are local. And just like we do businesses in Qatar or in China or in Brazil, and that is, I would say, a bit secret weapon for us to really understanding what's happening on the ground. Where are the risks, and how do you navigate through the geopolitics complexity?
Not parachuting in.
Not parachuting in. Yeah, not parachuting in.
All right, with that, Rachel, thank you very much.
Thank you, Erik. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure having you here.